Margaret had been thinking about this day for weeks, maybe even months. The thought of attending her high school's 50-year reunion filled her with a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. 50 years. Half a century had passed since she had walked the halls of Jefferson High as a shy, quiet teenager. Time had moved fast, but in her mind, the memories remained fresh, the laughter echoing in the corridors, the whispers of gossip behind lockers, the friends who had come and gone, and the teachers who had shaped her in ways she didn't fully understand at the time. On the morning of the reunion, Margaret woke early. She moved slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in her joints. A reminder that her body had changed, even if her mind still felt young. She stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the wrinkles in her blouse and brushing her gray hair. Trying to make herself look presentable, she chose a soft blue dress, something elegant but not too flashy, and slipped on her comfortable shoes. Comfort was important. She wanted to feel at ease. As she drove toward the hotel where the reunion was being held, memories of her school days floated through her mind. She remembered sitting quietly in classrooms, listening to lessons but rarely raising her hand. She remembered the laughter of her classmates, often at jokes she didn't understand, or sometimes at her own awkwardness. She had always been the girl in the background, the one who didn't get invited to parties, the one whose name was sometimes forgotten in the shuffle of adolescence. Margaret also thought about the life she had built since then. She had married a kind man who had supported her in every way. They had children, then grandchildren, and her days had been filled with the small, meaningful joys of family, work, and community. She had always been quiet, not seeking attention, but her life had been rich in ways that mattered to her. Yet, despite these fulfilling years, there remained a small, lingering question in her heart. Would her classmates even remember her? Would they see the person she had become? Or would she still be invisible to them, just as she had often felt in school? When Margaret arrived at the hotel, she paused for a moment at the entrance. The large, elegant building seemed almost overwhelming. Inside, the reunion was already in full swing. She could hear laughter spilling from the ballroom doors, the clinking of glasses, and the soft background music that filled the air. She took a deep breath, held her purse tightly, and stepped inside. The sight of the crowd made her heart race. Alumni she had not seen in decades were greeting each other warmly, hugging, laughing, and reminiscing about old times. The room was filled with energy, excitement, and familiarity. Yet, despite the liveliness around her, Margaret immediately felt a pang of anxiety. No one seemed to notice her as she entered. She offered polite smiles to a few passing faces, but they either nodded quickly or smiled vaguely before moving on. Margaret felt a familiar sting, the same feeling she had experienced so many times in her life, from her school days to moments in adulthood when she had been overlooked. She reminded herself that this was normal, that she didn't need anyone's approval to enjoy herself. Still, the ache of being ignored settled in her chest like a weight. She walked slowly toward a quiet corner of the room, hoping to find a table where she could sit and observe the crowd without feeling too conspicuous. From her vantage point, she could see groups of former classmates chatting and laughing together. Some had changed so much she barely recognized them, while others looked remarkably similar to the teenagers she once knew. The energy of their camaraderie was both comforting and painful. It reminded her of the connections she had never fully had, the friendships that had eluded her in high school. As she watched, Margaret's mind drifted back to the past. She remembered the girls who had ruled the social scene, their confidence shining like a spotlight that she had never dared to step into. She remembered the boys who had been popular for reasons she didn't understand at the time. And she remembered herself, always standing at the edges, quietly observing, quietly learning, quietly hoping that someday she would be seen. Margaret took a sip of her water and tried to push away the negative thoughts. She reminded herself that she had achieved so much in her life, that her worth was not defined by the attention of others, no matter how much she had longed for it in her youth. She thought about her children, who had always told her she was special, and her grandchildren, who adored her stories and the warmth of her presence. She realized that the validation she sought had always been within her, even if it had taken a lifetime to recognize. Minutes passed, and the crowd around her seemed to grow louder, more energetic. Margaret noticed a few familiar faces glance her way, offering polite smiles, but none approached to strike up a conversation. She began to feel the familiar loneliness creeping in, but this time, it was tempered by a quiet determination. She did not want to leave this reunion feeling invisible. She did not want to let 50 years of life experience go unrecognized, even in the eyes of those who had once overlooked her. Margaret took a deep breath and reminded herself that she had a voice, a story, and a presence that deserved to be acknowledged. She decided that, for the first time in a long while, she would step out of the shadows. She would not simply observe, she would find a way to make herself known. As she scanned the room, she noticed the stage at the front of the ballroom, where a microphone stood ready. The host was preparing to call alumni up to speak, to share memories and reflections from their lives since graduation. A spark of courage lit within Margaret. Perhaps this was the opportunity she had been waiting for, the moment to claim her place among her peers and finally be heard. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. What if no one listened? What if they dismissed her the way they had done so many times before? The fear was real, but stronger than it was the determination to take a chance, to step forward, and to honor her own life in her own way. Margaret straightened her back, adjusted her dress, and took another deep breath. She reminded herself that this reunion was not about proving herself to anyone else. It was about acknowledging her own journey, celebrating the life she had lived, and finally allowing herself to be seen. With that thought, Margaret felt a small but steady wave of confidence wash over her. She would not shrink into the background. She would not allow 50 years of living quietly to go unnoticed tonight. Margaret took one last look around the room. The laughter and chatter continued, but now it seemed to invite her in rather than exclude her. She felt a sense of readiness she had never known in her school years. A readiness to face the past and transform it into something powerful. And with that, she began to move toward the stage. Each step deliberate and steady, carrying with her the hopes, memories, and quiet strength of a life that had always been full, even if it had often gone unnoticed. Margaret slowly moved through the crowd, trying to catch the attention of someone, anyone, who might remember her. She offered smiles, small waves, even a tentative hello. But most of them were met with polite nods or quick glances before the people returned to their groups. She felt that familiar sting in her chest, the same feeling she had known in high school when no one chose her for games, projects, or even casual conversation. She shook her head slightly, telling herself not to dwell on it, but it was hard. The years had not erased the memories of being overlooked, and tonight, it seemed like history was repeating itself. Margaret found an empty table near the edge of the room. She sat down quietly, arranging her purse and clutching her water glass as if it were an anchor. From her seat, she could see the entire ballroom. People were laughing, catching up, and reminiscing about their school days. They shared stories of pranks, school dances, sports games, and friendships that had lasted decades. Margaret listened carefully, her heart aching a little with the realization that most of these experiences had not included her. She remembered watching from the sidelines, often too shy or afraid to join, and the thought of 50 years passing without those connections still lingering felt heavy. She overheard a conversation between two women who were clearly close friends. They were laughing about their senior prom, talking about the dress one of them had worn and how the boys had all gathered around another girl. Margaret felt a pang of loneliness. She had attended the prom, but she had gone with a small group of acquaintances who had quickly drifted away. No one had remembered her, and she had danced alone for much of the night, too timid to ask anyone else. That memory had faded over the years, but tonight it returned vividly. Margaret's thoughts wandered to the teachers she had loved and admired. Mrs. Caldwell, her English teacher, had always encouraged her to write and express herself, praising her essays even when others ignored them. Mr. Jensen, her history teacher, had once told her that quiet people often see the world in ways others cannot. Margaret realized that those words had shaped her life, giving her a sense of worth that her peers had never offered. She smiled softly at the memory, feeling a tiny spark of warmth amid the disappointment of the evening. She tried to focus on the positive, reminding herself of the life she had built. Her family was her pride and joy. She had raised children who were kind, curious, and compassionate. She had helped her grandchildren with their homework, listened to their dreams, and shared stories from her own youth. She had volunteered at the local library and helped organize community events, quietly touching lives in ways that few might ever notice. These thoughts comforted her, giving her a sense of purpose and pride that had nothing to do with high school popularity. Still, as the reunion continued, Margaret felt the weight of invisibility pressing down on her. She observed groups of former classmates hugging, chatting, and laughing as if no time had passed, and she realized how deeply human the desire to be remembered was. She wanted to feel seen, to hear someone say her name with recognition, to know that she mattered in the tapestry of their shared past. She had come hoping for warmth, for connection, but it seemed that the years had not bridged the gaps of adolescence. Margaret took another sip of water, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She noticed a few people glance her way, some offering polite smiles, but no one approached. She felt like a ghost, drifting through a world that had once seemed so vibrant, but now appeared indifferent to her presence. Yet even as the sadness threatened to overwhelm her, a quiet determination began to grow. She refused to let 50 years of life pass without asserting herself. She had stories to tell, experiences worth sharing, and a voice that deserved to be heard. As she watched, she noticed a few classmates whispering to each other, glancing her way, and then quickly turning back to their conversations. She realized that even though they were polite, no one truly knew her now, or perhaps they had never really known her at all. The thought was painful, but it also sparked something inside her, a desire to take control of the moment. She would not wait for validation. She would create it herself. Margaret's eyes wandered to the stage at the front of the room. The host was organizing a list of speakers, calling a few people to the microphone to share stories from their lives since graduation. She listened to a man speak about his career, his family, and his travels around the world. The audience laughed at his anecdotes and applauded politely at the end. Margaret felt a small flicker of envy but also a realization. This was her chance. If she wanted to be recognized, if she wanted her voice to be heard, she would need to step forward. Her mind raced with questions. What would she say? Would anyone listen? What if they dismissed her the way they had always done in school? The fear was real, but so was her growing determination. She thought about her husband, who had passed away several years ago, always encouraging her to believe in herself. She remembered his gentle words. "You have a voice, Margaret. Don't ever be afraid to use it." Those words strengthened her resolve. Tonight was not about proving herself to others, it was about honoring her life and her experiences. Margaret began to stand, feeling the stiffness in her legs, but also a newfound sense of purpose. She took slow, deliberate steps toward the stage, weaving through tables and clusters of people. Some glanced at her with curiosity, others barely noticed. But Margaret kept moving, focusing on the microphone and the small spotlight waiting for her at the front. She felt her heart pounding, but each beat was a reminder of her courage, a rhythm that propelled her forward. As she neared the stage, she felt a mixture of fear and excitement. The memories of being overlooked, of being invisible, threatened to overwhelm her. But she pushed them aside. She reminded herself that she was not the same shy teenager she had been 50 years ago. She was stronger now, wiser, and filled with experiences that mattered. She had learned that being ignored by others did not define her worth. Her life had value. Her story had meaning. And tonight, she would claim her moment. Margaret reached the stage and hesitated for a moment, looking out at the audience. Faces blurred together, some familiar, some strangers, but none seemed prepared for what she was about to do. She stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it slightly, and took a deep breath. Her hands trembled, but she held them steady. She knew that once she began speaking, there would be no turning back. In that moment, Margaret felt a strange calm wash over her. The loneliness, the years of being overlooked, the fear of being dismissed. All of it melted into a quiet determination. She was no longer the girl standing in the background, forgotten and ignored. She was Margaret, a woman who had lived, loved, and learned. And now she would share her story with those who had never truly seen her before. She opened her mouth to speak, and for the first time that evening, she felt the room truly notice her. Heads turned, whispers stopped, and eyes focused on her. The energy shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if the crowd sensed that something remarkable was about to unfold. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of nervousness and exhilaration, but she held her ground. She would not falter. She would not shrink. She would be seen, and she would be heard. And in that quiet moment, as she prepared to speak, Margaret realized something profound. The fear of being ignored had given way to the courage to stand tall. The sadness of 50 years of invisibility had been transformed into the strength to claim her space, her voice, and her story. The night was still young, but for Margaret, a new chapter had already begun, the chapter where she would step into the light, no longer overlooked, and finally be recognized for the remarkable life she had lived. Margaret's steps toward the stage were slow but determined. Each movement felt heavier than the last, but also more meaningful. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and excitement. She felt as though the room had shifted slightly. The chatter of the crowd had dimmed in her mind, and all that existed was the path to the microphone at the center of the room. She remembered the girl she once had been, quiet and shy, invisible in the hallways of Jefferson High. That girl had felt powerless, unsure of herself, and constantly overlooked. But that girl had grown into Margaret, a woman who had lived a full life, endured challenges, celebrated small victories, and quietly made a difference in the lives of those around her. Tonight, she would step into the light, and finally, the world would see her. The closer she got to the stage, the more the room seemed to notice her. Heads turned, some with curiosity, some with surprise. Margaret could sense a quiet murmur spreading through the crowd, a subtle change in the energy of the room. People who had been busy with their conversations paused for a moment, glancing at the woman who had suddenly moved toward the stage. Margaret felt a jolt of nervousness. Would they even care about what she had to say? Would they dismiss her as just another elderly woman trying to get attention? She pushed these doubts aside and focused on her breathing, reminding herself of the purpose that had brought her here. As she reached the stage, she felt the small tremble in her hands, a sign of both fear and excitement. The microphone stood before her, gleaming under the soft light, as if inviting her to speak. Margaret placed her hands gently on the podium. Taking a moment to steady herself, she thought about her husband, who had always encouraged her to believe in her own voice. She could almost hear his calm, reassuring words in her mind. "You have something to share, Margaret. Don't be afraid." Those words gave her courage. She was ready. Margaret adjusted the microphone slightly, tilting it to the right height. She cleared her throat softly, glancing at the audience. Faces stared back at her, some with recognition, some with curiosity, and a few with polite indifference. She could feel the room holding its collective breath. It was a strange feeling, both terrifying and exhilarating. She was no longer the shy teenager fading into the background. She was Margaret, a woman with a story to tell, and tonight, she would share it. Her mind raced as she considered where to begin. How could she convey 50 years of life in just a few minutes? How could she make them understand the struggles she had faced, the lessons she had learned, and the joys she had experienced? Margaret realized that she didn't need to impress them with accomplishments or status. She didn't need to compete for attention. All she needed was honesty, authenticity, and the courage to speak her truth. That thought grounded her, calming the tremor in her hands and the flutter in her stomach. Margaret took a deep breath and began softly, almost whispering at first. Her voice carried a hint of uncertainty, but it was steady and sincere. She started with memories from high school, sharing her perspective as a quiet student who often watched from the sidelines. She described her experiences of being overlooked, The times when invitations were forgotten, and the moments of isolation that had shaped her understanding of the world. She did not speak with anger or resentment. Instead, she spoke with reflection, conveying the feelings of a young girl who had simply wanted to be noticed and valued. As Margaret continued, her voice grew stronger. She spoke about the small victories she had experienced over the years, the friends she had made, the family she had raised, and the contributions she had quietly made to her community. She spoke of volunteering at local events, helping children learn to read, and supporting neighbors in need. Each story was a piece of her life, a testament to her resilience and compassion. As she shared these moments, she noticed the audience leaning in slightly, the curiosity and interest becoming more apparent. People were listening. They were finally seeing her. Margaret paused briefly to collect her thoughts. The microphone amplified her voice, making it sound clearer and stronger than she had expected. She felt a surge of confidence. Perhaps this was the moment she had been waiting for her entire life. The opportunity to step out of the shadows and claim her own space. She continued, recounting humorous incidents from her past, moments that brought laughter and warmth to the room. The audience responded, some chuckling softly, others smiling knowingly, as if connecting with her experiences on a personal level. The more Margaret spoke, the more the tension in her chest eased. She realized that she was no longer speaking for validation or recognition from those who had ignored her in school. She was speaking to honor herself, to acknowledge her journey, and to share the lessons she had learned. She spoke about the importance of kindness, perseverance, and finding joy in the little things. She reflected on the value of quiet contributions, the power of empathy, and the strength that comes from enduring life's challenges with grace. Margaret could see that her words were touching people in unexpected ways. Faces softened, eyes glistened, and whispers of admiration spread quietly through the room. People who had been busy with their own conversations now turned fully toward her, listening intently. Margaret felt a warmth in her heart that she had never experienced at a reunion before. She realized that being ignored in the past did not define her worth. It was her courage to speak now that commanded attention and respect. As she spoke, Margaret remembered her husband again, the man who had always believed in her when no one else did. She thought of the countless letters she had written, the moments of joy she had shared with her family, and the friendships she had nurtured quietly over the years. She understood that her life had been rich, meaningful, and full of love, even if it had not always been visible to others. Sharing her story on the stage was the culmination of that life, a public acknowledgement of everything she had experienced and achieved. The audience's reactions grew more apparent as Margaret recounted her most personal reflections. People nodded in understanding, some leaning forward as if they could feel her words directly. A few faces that had seemed indifferent now shone with admiration. Margaret realized that her courage had transformed the energy in the room. She had moved from the periphery to the center, and in doing so, had created a moment of connection that transcended 50 years of distance and misunderstanding. Margaret concluded her speech with a gentle, heartfelt message about the importance of self-worth, courage, and embracing one's own story. She spoke about how each person's life, no matter how quiet or overlooked, carries meaning and impact. She emphasized that recognition from others is gratifying, but the most powerful validation comes from within. Her voice, now steady and confident, resonated through the room, leaving an impression that was both profound and lasting. When she finally stepped back from the microphone, the room erupted in applause. Margaret felt a mixture of relief, pride, and joy. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but they were tears of triumph rather than sorrow. She had faced her fears, shared her truth, and claimed her moment. The classmates who had ignored her for decades now looked at her with admiration, some approaching to express their respect and congratulations. Margaret smiled warmly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time that evening, Margaret realized that her presence mattered. She had transformed from the quiet, overlooked girl into a woman whose voice, experiences, and courage could inspire others. She had proven to herself, and perhaps to the world, that it is never too late to step into the light, to claim your space, and to be seen for who you truly are. As she descended from the stage, Margaret felt lighter, freer, and more alive than she had in years. She carried with her not only the applause and recognition from the crowd but also a profound sense of personal achievement. She had turned a night that began with feelings of invisibility into an evening of empowerment, connection, and self-affirmation. Margaret knew that the reunion would be remembered for her speech, but more importantly, she knew it would be remembered in her heart as the night she finally embraced her own worth. She walked back to her table with her head held high, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a life fully acknowledged and celebrated. She had stepped forward, faced her fears, and, in doing so, had transformed not only the evening but herself. Margaret took another deep breath and let her thoughts settle. She knew that this was the moment that truly mattered. The small introductions and memories from high school were just the beginning. Now, she would speak from the heart, sharing her life, her lessons, and her experiences in a way that no one could ignore. She felt a mixture of nerves and excitement, but the courage that had brought her here now carried her forward. She glanced at the audience and noticed that all eyes were on her. The room had gone quiet, the chatter completely fading away, as if the people were holding their collective breath, waiting to hear what she had to say. She began by talking about her childhood and the challenges she had faced. Margaret described the quiet girl she had once been, the one who often felt invisible in school. She shared the moments of loneliness she had endured, the times when she had tried to reach out and been overlooked, and the nights she had spent wondering why she had always felt different. But she spoke not with anger or bitterness, but with honesty and reflection. She wanted the audience to understand that these experiences had shaped her, had taught her empathy, patience, and resilience, and had ultimately led her to become the woman she was today. As she spoke, Margaret noticed subtle changes in the audience. Some people nodded knowingly, recalling similar feelings from their own lives. Others looked at her with curiosity, leaning forward as if drawn in by the sincerity of her words. A few faces glistened with tears, moved by her courage and vulnerability. Margaret realized that her story was resonating, touching people in ways she had not anticipated. The quiet girl who had once been invisible was now commanding attention, not through status or accomplishments, but through truth and authenticity. Margaret then shifted to share her life after school. She spoke about the years of working in her community, volunteering, and helping others in quiet, meaningful ways. She described how she had taught children to read, organized neighborhood events, and supported her family and friends through challenges. These were not grand, headline-making achievements, but they were acts of love, compassion, and dedication that had given her life purpose. As she shared these stories, she noticed the audience's expressions soften, their eyes reflecting admiration and respect. People who had ignored her for decades were now seeing her in a new light. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in, and then began to weave humor into her speech. She recounted small, amusing incidents from her past moments when she had tried to fit in and failed in funny ways, times when she had misunderstood a joke or accidentally embarrassed herself. The audience laughed softly, and Margaret felt a warm sense of connection building. Humor, she realized, was a bridge. It allowed her to share her humanity, her imperfections, and her experiences in a way that was relatable and endearing. She smiled, feeling a sense of relief that people were not only listening but also engaging with her story. Margaret then moved to the deeper lessons she had learned in life. She spoke about kindness, the importance of showing compassion even when it goes unnoticed, of helping others without expecting recognition, and of understanding that small actions can have profound impacts. She shared personal examples: the single mother she had supported through difficult times, the lonely elderly neighbor she had visited regularly, and the students whose confidence she had quietly nurtured. Her words were simple but powerful, painting a picture of a life devoted to empathy and service. Next, Margaret addressed perseverance. She spoke about the challenges she had faced: loss, heartbreak, illness, and moments of doubt, but also about how she had never given up. She emphasized that life's difficulties were opportunities to grow, to learn, and to become stronger. The audience listened intently, some nodding, some wiping away tears. Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her words were not just being heard, but felt. She realized that her experiences, which had once seemed small or insignificant, were now inspiring others. Margaret then shared reflections on the importance of self-worth. She spoke candidly about the years she had spent feeling invisible, about the longing for recognition, and about the realization that true value comes from within. She encouraged everyone to embrace their own lives, to honor their journeys, and to recognize the impact they had made on the world, no matter how quiet or unseen. Her voice was steady and clear, conveying both strength and sincerity. The audience seemed captivated, many nodding in agreement, some smiling, and others quietly moved. As she continued, Margaret spoke about love and family. She shared stories of her late husband, who had always believed in her, of the children she had raised, and the grandchildren who brought joy to her life. She described the importance of nurturing relationships, cherishing moments with loved ones, and finding happiness in simple things. Her words were warm and heartfelt, drawing laughter and smiles from the audience as they connected with the universal experiences she described. Margaret felt her heart swell with gratitude for the life she had lived, even as she acknowledged the challenges and loneliness she had faced along the way. Margaret then returned to humor briefly, recounting a funny story from her early years of marriage, when she had tried to cook a complicated dinner and ended up with a disaster in the kitchen. The audience laughed, and Margaret joined in, feeling lighter and more connected than ever. Humor, she realized, was not just a way to entertain but a tool to break down barriers, to make her audience feel comfortable and open to her message. She smiled as she noticed people leaning forward, hanging on to every word, genuinely interested in her story. Finally, Margaret concluded her speech with a powerful message about courage and resilience. She emphasized that it was never too late to speak up, to take action, or to share one's story. She reminded everyone that each person's life, no matter how quiet or overlooked, carried meaning and impact. She spoke about the importance of embracing one's own journey, of celebrating small victories, and of recognizing that being seen and heard begins with claiming your own space in the world. The room was silent for a moment as Margaret finished, and then, slowly, applause began. It started with a few claps, soft and tentative, and then grew louder and louder, filling the room with warmth and admiration. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from a deep sense of accomplishment and joy. She had done it. She had shared her story, spoken her truth, and touched the hearts of people who had once overlooked her. She had transformed the evening from a moment of invisibility into one of connection, recognition, and inspiration. People began approaching her, offering compliments, shaking her hand, and expressing admiration. Some apologized for having forgotten her, while others shared that they had never truly known her, but were now inspired by her courage and perspective. Margaret smiled at each person, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had not come to the reunion seeking validation, but she had found it anyway, not in the approval of others, but in the simple act of speaking her truth and being fully present. As the applause and congratulations continued, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, claiming her space and her voice. She realized that the impact of her words extended beyond the room, reaching into the hearts of those who had listened, and perhaps inspiring them to reflect on their own lives and actions. For Margaret, this moment was not just about recognition. It was about empowerment, connection, and the triumph of courage over fear. The evening continued, but for Margaret, the reunion had already reached its most meaningful moment. She had faced her fears, embraced her experiences, and shared her story in a way that touched the lives of others. She walked back to her seat with her head held high, feeling the weight of invisibility lift from her shoulders. She had transformed the night, not by changing others' perceptions, but by embracing her own worth and living her truth. Margaret's heart was full as she sat down, and she noticed the subtle shift in the room. People who had once ignored her now looked at her with respect, curiosity, and admiration. Conversations paused as she passed by. Smiles were offered, and eyes followed her with newfound recognition. Margaret realized that her courage had not only transformed her own experience, but had also created ripples of inspiration for those around her. The night continued with laughter, stories, and reconnections. But Margaret's speech remained the heart of the evening. People would talk about it for weeks, remembering the quiet woman who had taken the stage and shared her life with honesty, humor, and wisdom. For Margaret, however, the lasting impact was personal. She had proven to herself that being overlooked in the past did not define her worth. She had found her voice, claimed her place, and reminded everyone, including herself, that life is measured not by attention or recognition, but by courage, kindness, and authenticity. As Margaret looked around the room one last time that night, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The reunion had started with feelings of invisibility and loneliness, but it had ended with connection, recognition, and empowerment. She had transformed not only her own experience but also the energy of the entire room. Margaret had spoken her truth, embraced her worth, and left a mark that would be remembered by all who had listened. Margaret slowly stepped down from the stage, her legs a little shaky but her heart light with the joy of what she had just accomplished. The applause from the audience still echoed in the room, warm and genuine, and she could feel the energy around her shifting. People who had ignored her earlier now looked at her with newfound respect, their expressions soft with admiration. She smiled quietly to herself, a mixture of relief and pride filling her chest. For the first time that night, Margaret felt truly seen, not just as the quiet girl who had been overlooked in school, but as the woman she had become. Someone who had lived a meaningful and impactful life. As she made her way back to her table, several classmates approached her. They spoke with a mixture of surprise, respect, and apology. Some confessed that they had never realized how remarkable her life had been, while others admitted that they had overlooked her in high school and felt ashamed. Margaret listened politely, smiling, but she did not dwell on the past. She understood that what mattered now was the present, the connections she was building in this moment, and the acknowledgement that she had finally taken her rightful place in the room. A small group of women who had once been part of the popular circle approached Margaret. They were hesitant at first, unsure how to interact with someone they had barely noticed decades ago. But Margaret greeted them warmly, offering a kind smile and engaging in conversation. She shared a few light-hearted stories from her past, and soon laughter filled the space between them. The ice had broken, and genuine connections began to form. Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing that bridges could be built. Even after so many years, a man she remembered from her science class, someone she had always admired but who had barely spoken to her in school, came forward as well. He shook her hand firmly and said, "Margaret, that was incredible. I never knew how much you had done with your life. You are truly inspiring." Margaret felt a lump in her throat as she thanked him, realizing that this was the first time many of these classmates were truly seeing her accomplishments and her character. It was not just applause, they were recognizing her value, her experiences, and the courage it had taken to share them. As the evening continued, Margaret found herself in conversation with several former classmates who were genuinely interested in her life story. They asked questions, listened intently, and shared their own experiences in return. Margaret felt a warmth and connection that she had never expected to find at this reunion. She realized that the act of speaking her truth had transformed not only how others saw her, but how she saw herself. She was no longer the shy, invisible girl. She was a confident, capable woman who had claimed her place in the world. Margaret reflected on the lessons she had shared in her speech, the importance of kindness, perseverance, and valuing oneself. She noticed that her words seemed to have resonated with many people in the room. Some nodded thoughtfully, others smiled knowingly, and a few whispered to each other, clearly discussing the impact of her speech. Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had shared her story not to boast or seek validation, but to honor her journey and inspire others. And in doing so, she had achieved something even more meaningful. She had reminded everyone, including herself, that every life carries value, and every story deserves to be heard. The reunion continued into the evening, with music, dancing, and laughter filling the hall. Margaret joined a few people on the dance floor, moving slowly but confidently, enjoying the energy of the room. She realized that the fear she had felt upon arriving, fear of being ignored or dismissed, had completely disappeared. Instead, she felt light, joyful, and empowered. The applause, the smiles, and the kind words of her classmates were affirmations of her courage. But the real victory was the inner transformation she had experienced. She had faced her fears, embraced her worth, and stepped into the light in a way she had never done before. As the night drew to a close, Margaret found a quiet moment to herself near the entrance of the ballroom. She looked around at the groups of classmates chatting, laughing, and reconnecting. She realized that the reunion had started with a sense of loneliness and invisibility. But it had ended with connection, recognition, and celebration. Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had come to this reunion uncertain of what awaited her. And yet she was leaving with her heart full, her spirit lifted, and her confidence stronger than ever. She thought about her husband again, imagining his gentle smile and proud eyes. She whispered a quiet thank you to him, feeling that he was with her in spirit. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the challenges, the quiet victories, the years of helping others, and the moments of self-doubt she had overcome. Each step of her life had led to this moment, and she felt grateful for every experience, both joyful and difficult. Margaret realized that her life had been rich, meaningful, and full of purpose, even when it had gone unnoticed by others. Several classmates approached Margaret one last time before the night ended, offering hugs, handshakes, and words of admiration. They expressed gratitude for her courage. Inspired by her honesty and the lessons she had shared, Margaret smiled warmly at each person, feeling the deep satisfaction of knowing that she had made a lasting impression. The recognition she received was not just about the past, it was a celebration of her present self, her growth, and the strength she had cultivated over 50 years. As the guests began to leave, Margaret lingered for a moment, savoring the experience. She walked slowly toward the exit, her steps steady and confident. She felt lighter than she had in years, as if a weight that had been carried for decades had been lifted from her shoulders. The evening had been transformative, not because others finally acknowledged her, but because she had taken control of her narrative and spoken her truth. She had embraced her own story, celebrated her journey, and claimed her place in the world. Margaret paused outside the hotel, taking in the cool night air. She looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of wonder and gratitude. Life had been challenging, full of moments of doubt and loneliness, but it had also been filled with beauty, love, and resilience. Margaret realized that recognition from others was meaningful, but the true measure of her life was the courage she had shown, the kindness she had shared, and the authenticity with which she had lived. She had finally understood that her worth had never depended on the attention of others, it had always been within her. As she drove home, Margaret reflected on the evening with a sense of calm and fulfillment. The reunion had begun as a test, a moment of vulnerability where she feared being invisible once again, but it had ended as a celebration, a moment where she had stepped into the light, shared her story, and been recognized not for popularity, but for courage, honesty, and the impact of a life well lived. Margaret felt proud of herself, not for the applause or recognition, but for the bravery it had taken to speak, to be seen, and to honor her own journey. When Margaret arrived home, she was greeted by the familiar warmth of her home, the memories of her family, and the quiet satisfaction of a life filled with purpose. She reflected on the night, knowing that it would remain in her heart forever, not as a moment of validation from others, but as a powerful reminder of her courage, resilience, and self-worth. Margaret understood that it was never too late to step forward, claim your space, and share your story. She had lived 50 years with quiet dignity, and now, she had finally shared that dignity with the world. Sitting in her favorite chair, Margaret closed her eyes and allowed herself to smile. The night had been everything she had hoped for, and more. She had faced fear, embraced her worth, and transformed her experience into something beautiful and inspiring. Margaret knew that she would carry the memory of this reunion with her forever, a reminder that life's true victories are measured not by attention or popularity, but by courage, kindness, and the willingness to speak your truth. For Margaret, the reunion was no longer just a gathering of classmates. It had become a celebration of life itself. She had taken her place in the world, not as the quiet girl who had once been overlooked, but as a woman of strength, resilience, and wisdom. She had shown that even after 50 years, it was possible to claim your voice, embrace your worth, and leave a lasting impact on those around you. And with that thought, Margaret leaned back in her chair, her heart full, her spirit lifted, and a gentle smile on her face. She had come to the reunion uncertain of what awaited her, and she was leaving with the profound knowledge that she had finally been seen, heard, and celebrated for the remarkable life she had lived.